something. Where'd you get this uniform? Looks like a costume to me.
Yeah, this uniform's mine, officer. Give my military ID and travel orders.
Yeah, I don't believe that. Anyone can fake paperwork like this. Turn around now.
Officer, this is a mistake. I'm
Hands on the vehicle. Do not move. You're under arrest.
Late Tuesday evening, Officer Daniel Mercer, badge number 4912, pulled his patrol car into a brightly lit gas station just outside the city limits of Brookhaven. What caught his attention wasn't suspicious behavior, a reported crime, or a dispatch call. It was a black man standing beside a rental sedan, wearing a full United States Navy dress uniform. Mercer made a decision in seconds. That uniform had to be fake. Without checking plates, without running any information, and without any indication of criminal activity, Mercer exited his cruiser and walked toward the man with deliberate aggression. His posture was confrontational, his hand hovering near his belt, his eyes scanning the uniform not with curiosity but with accusation. The man was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, a 35-year-old active-duty Navy Special Operations Service member who had just returned to the United States after a classified overseas deployment. Mercer didn't know that. He also didn't know that every second of what he was about to do was being captured by 3 high-definition security cameras mounted above the fuel pumps. And he certainly didn't know that this encounter would trigger a federal investigation, end his law enforcement career, and expose him to criminal charges carrying a mandatory minimum sentence measured in decades. "Hey," Mercer barked. "What do you think you're doing?" Reed turned calmly, years of military discipline settling into his posture automatically. He had been traveling for nearly 24 hours straight, 2 international flights, a layover, customs, and a long drive through familiar roads he hadn't seen in 8 months. "Fueling my car, officer," Reed replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" Mercer's eyes moved slowly over the uniform, the dark blue dress coat, the ribbon rack, the warfare insignia. The rank markings clearly identifying Reed as a senior enlisted service member. Instead of easing the officer's concern, the details only hardened his suspicion. "Where did you get that uniform?" Mercer asked sharply. Reed felt the shift immediately, the tone, the assumption, the quiet hostility that didn't need to be explained. "I'm active-duty Navy," Reed said. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed." Mercer scoffed. "Navy Special Operations," he said. "I don't buy that." Reed had expected curiosity, maybe a question, maybe even respect. What he got was disbelief. For 12 years, Reed had served his country. He had passed one of the most demanding military selection programs in existence. He had deployed multiple times to locations he couldn't name, doing missions he could never describe. The uniform he wore wasn't symbolic, it was earned through exhaustion, injury, and sacrifice. Mercer saw none of that. "I need to see your military ID," the officer snapped. Reed moved slowly and deliberately, narrating his actions out of habit and safety. He removed his Department of Defense identification card, along with his official travel orders authorizing uniform transit, and handed them over. Everything was legitimate, verifiable, standard. Mercer examined the documents as if searching for a flaw that didn't exist. "This could be fake," he muttered. "People lie about this stuff all the time." "It's valid," Reed said calmly. "You're welcome to verify it through my command." Mercer didn't respond. His jaw tightened. His posture changed. The decision had already been made. A man at the adjacent pump had stopped filling his truck and was watching. Inside the convenience store, the clerk leaned closer to the window. Above them all, the cameras kept recording. "Step away from the vehicle," Mercer ordered. "Am I being detained?" Reed asked. "I haven't committed a crime." "You're wearing a uniform I believe is stolen," Mercer replied. "That's a federal offense." Reed took a slow breath. He had survived combat zones. He had survived missions most Americans would never know existed. And now, at a gas station 20 minutes from home, he was about to be arrested because an officer couldn't believe a black man could have earned what he was wearing. "I am complying," Reed said clearly. "I am active-duty United States Navy. I am not resisting." Mercer reached for his handcuffs, and as the metal closed around Reed's wrists, the moment crossed a line it could never come back from. The handcuffs clicked shut with unnecessary force, biting into Marcus Reed's wrists as Officer Mercer pulled his arms behind his back. Reed didn't flinch. Years of training had taught him control, even when adrenaline surged and instinct screamed that something was deeply wrong. "I am not resisting," Reed said clearly, raising his voice just enough to carry. "I am Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, United States Navy. I am being detained without cause." Mercer ignored him. He guided Reed toward the patrol car as if escorting a dangerous suspect, not a service member in full dress uniform whose identification and orders were still in the officer's possession. At Pump 6, the man with the pickup truck had his phone raised, recording openly now. "That's a real uniform," the witness called out. "You can't do that." "Stay back," Mercer snapped. "This doesn't involve you." "It does now," the man replied. "Everyone can see this." The gas station clerk stepped outside, frozen in disbelief as Reed, decorated, uniformed, compliant, was placed into the back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, sealing Reed inside. Through the tinted glass, Reed watched the overhead cameras blinking silently. He knew those cameras. He'd briefed operations with less coverage than this gas station had. Mercer keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I've got one in custody," he said. "Suspected stolen valor. Location is the Horizon Fuel on Route 18. Reed spoke again, deliberately. "This arrest is unlawful," he said. "You are detaining an active duty service member." "My military ID and travel orders are valid." No response. The patrol car pulled away. 15 minutes later, they arrived at the Brookhaven Police Department, a modest concrete building that had processed drunk drivers, shoplifters, and bar fights for decades. It had never processed a Navy Special Operations chief accused of impersonating himself. Inside the booking area, Desk Sergeant Alan Brewer looked up and immediately stood. "Why is there a sailor in handcuffs?" Brewer asked. "Stolen valor," Mercer said flatly. "He's pretending to be Special Operations." Reed turned his head slightly. "Sergeant," he said calmly, "I'm not pretending, I'm active duty. I need to contact my command immediately." Brewer studied him more closely now. The uniform, the ribbons, the insignia, everything was exact down to the spacing and wear. "Let me see his ID," Brewer said. Mercer hesitated, then handed it over. Brewer examined the card under the desk light, the holograms, the seal, the embedded security strip. He flipped to the orders next, reading line by line. "These look legitimate," Brewer said slowly. "They're not," Mercer insisted. "I can tell." Brewer looked up. "Tell how?" Mercer didn't answer. The silence said more than words ever could. "Sir," Reed said, keeping his composure, "civilian law enforcement is required to notify military command when detaining active duty personnel." Brewer nodded and reached for the phone. "Who do I call?" Reed gave him the number. Moments later, Brewer handed the phone to Reed, who awkwardly held it between shoulder and ear, wrists still cuffed behind him. "Naval Special Operations Duty Desk," a voice answered. "This is Chief Petty Officer Reed," he said. "I've been arrested by local police under a false stolen valor claim. I need immediate command notification." There was a pause, then, "Stand by, Chief. Where are you?" Reed gave the address. "Do not say anything else," the voice replied. "Legal and command are being activated." The call ended. Mercer rolled his eyes. "Fake phone call won't help you," he muttered. But within minutes, the atmosphere in the room began to change. Brewer's desk phone rang, then rang again and again. Mercer didn't notice at first, but the system had already started moving, and it was moving fast. The first sign that things were no longer under local control came quietly. Sergeant Brewer's phone rang again. This time when he answered, his posture changed immediately. He straightened, turned slightly away from the desk, and lowered his voice. "Yes, sir, I understand. Yes, he's here now." He hung up and looked directly at Officer Mercer. "Who exactly did you say this man was?" Brewer asked. Mercer crossed his arms. "I told you, he's impersonating military, stolen valor." Brewer didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked back at Marcus Reed, who stood cuffed but composed, his uniform still perfectly aligned despite everything. "Chief," Brewer said, "you said you're Special Operations." "Yes, Sergeant," Reed replied. "Active duty." Before Mercer could interject, the front door of the station opened. Two men in suits stepped inside, not uniforms, not local. Their movements were precise, practiced. One flashed credentials at the desk before anyone could ask. "Naval Criminal Investigative Service," he said. "We're here for Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed." The room went silent. Mercer's confidence evaporated in a single breath. "That's him," Brewer said, pointing toward the holding area. The NCIS agent approached the bars, took one look at Reed's uniform, then turned back toward Brewer with visible anger. "Why is he restrained?" "Officer Mercer arrested him," Brewer said carefully. "Suspected stolen valor." The second agent, this one from the FBI, stepped forward. "That suspicion has already been disproven," he said. "His identity, service record, and deployment status have been verified through Department of Defense systems." Mercer stepped forward, voice tight. "There must be a mistake." "There isn't," the NCIS agent replied. "He's a senior enlisted operator who just returned from a classified deployment." Mercer's face drained of color. I didn't know," he stammered. "You were shown valid ID and orders," the FBI agent said. "And you ignored them." He turned to Brewer. "Release him now." Brewer unlocked the cell immediately. Reed stepped out, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left red marks. The NCIS agent nodded respectfully. "Chief Reed, are you injured?" "No," Reed said, "just unlawfully detained." The agents turned back toward Mercer. "Officer Daniel Mercer," the FBI agent said, "you are now the subject of a federal investigation for interference with military personnel and deprivation of rights under color of law." Mercer tried to speak. "Do not say another word," the agent cut in. "You need a lawyer." Outside, more vehicles arrived, unmarked SUVs, government plates. A uniformed Navy commander stepped through the doors moments later, his presence commanding instant attention. "I'm Commander Lewis," he said, "Naval Special Warfare." His eyes locked onto Reed. "Chief," he said quietly, "we're taking you home." Then he turned toward Mercer. "You arrested one of my people." The police chief arrived minutes later, having been called in urgently. He took in the scene, the federal agents, the Navy commander, the silent officer who now wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. What happened? The chief asked. The FBI agent answered. Your officer arrested an active-duty service member based solely on disbelief and bias. Mercer's silence confirmed everything. The chief exhaled slowly. This department will cooperate fully, he said. The NCIS agent nodded. Good, because this doesn't end here. Reed stood quietly as the room moved around him, the weight of the moment settling in. Less than 2 hours earlier, he had been thinking about his daughters, about dinner, about home. Now the federal government was involved, and Officer Mercer was about to learn what happens when assumption overrides law. The booking area no longer felt like a small-town police station. Federal agents filled the room. Radios crackled, phones rang non-stop. The quiet authority of the Navy commander shifted the entire atmosphere, turning what had been a routine arrest into a controlled federal response. Officer Mercer stood frozen near the wall. Commander Lewis faced the police chief directly. This sailor was returning from an active deployment, he said. He is protected under federal law. Your officer interfered with military personnel performing authorized transit. The chief nodded stiffly. I understand, Commander. You will, Lewis replied fully. An NCIS agent opened a folder and began documenting. Officer Mercer, he said, you arrested Chief Petty Officer Reed after being presented with valid Department of Defense identification and official orders. You then transported him to this facility and processed him for booking. Mercer swallowed. I believe the uniform was stolen. Based on what? The FBI agent asked. Mercer hesitated. He didn't look right, Mercer said. The room went still. The police chief closed his eyes. Explain that, the FBI agent said calmly. Mercer's voice dropped. I've handled stolen valor cases before. Something felt off. How many? The agent asked. 6, Mercer said quietly. And how many involved black service members? The agent followed up. Mercer didn't answer. The NCIS agent flipped a page in the folder. We reviewed your record, he said. 5 of those 6 arrests involved black men. 4 were later confirmed to be legitimate active-duty military. The chief looked sharply at Mercer. Is that true? Mercer said nothing. That's not pattern recognition, the FBI agent said. That's racial profiling. Reed stood nearby, silent, his posture steady. He had been trained to absorb pressure without reacting, but every word landed. Commander Lewis addressed the chief again. Chief Reed didn't just return from deployment, he said. He returned from an operation still classified at levels your department doesn't have access to. Detaining him created operational risk. The NCIS agent added, and confiscating his military ID as evidence compounds that risk. Mercer's knees visibly weakened. I didn't mean intent is irrelevant, the FBI agent interrupted. Federal statutes don't require malicious intent when rights are violated under color of law. He turned to his partner. Read the charges. The agent did. Interference with military personnel, false imprisonment of a federal employee, deprivation of rights under color of law, civil rights violations with bias enhancements. Mercer's breathing became shallow. These charges carry significant prison exposure, the agent continued. Decades, the word echoed, decades. The police chief removed his cap and set it on the desk. Officer Mercer, he said quietly, you are suspended pending federal review. Turn in your weapon and badge. Mercer stared at him. Chief, now, the chief said. Mercer unclipped his badge with shaking hands. The sound of metal hitting the desk was louder than it should have been. Commander Lewis turned to Reed. Chief, you're free to go. Reed nodded. Before leaving, he spoke, calm, measured, controlled. I complied with every instruction, he said. I presented proof. I remained respectful. He looked directly at Mercer, and that still wasn't enough. The FBI agent escorted Mercer aside. You're not under arrest yet, he said, but you will be. Outside, night had fallen. Reed stepped out of the station surrounded by federal personnel. Somewhere nearby, his phone buzzed, a message from his wife asking if he was close. He typed back one word. Almost. Behind him, inside the station, Officer Mercer sat alone, staring at the wall. The uniform he doubted was already homeward bound, and the consequences he never imagined were just beginning. The federal response did not slow down overnight. By morning, the incident report from the Brookhaven Police Department had already been overridden by federal documentation. The gas station security footage was formally seized. Witness cell phone videos were cataloged as evidence. Officer Mercer's body camera, conspicuously activated only after the handcuffs were applied, was pulled for forensic review. Within 24 hours, the U.S. Attorney's Office assumed jurisdiction. A federal prosecutor named Elaine Porter reviewed the footage personally. She watched Mercer approach Reed with immediate hostility. She watched Reed present valid military identification. She watched Mercer say, I don't believe that, and proceed with the arrest anyway. She watched it twice. Then she made the call. A grand jury was convened within the week. Officer Mercer was placed on unpaid administrative leave and ordered not to leave the state. His badge and firearm were confiscated. His union representative advised him to remain silent. The advice came too late. Internal Affairs pulled Mercer's full personnel file. 32 civilian complaints, 25 involving black residents, repeated allegations of harassment, unlawful detention, and excessive stops. None had ended his career until now. Federal investigators established a clear pattern. Mercer treated black men as suspects first and citizens second. Military uniform or not, Chief Petty Officer Reed provided a sworn statement detailing the arrest, the confiscation of his ID, and the emotional toll of being treated as a criminal while wearing the uniform he had earned through service. But the most powerful evidence wasn't Reed's testimony, it was Mercer's own words captured clearly on video. "I don't buy that. I can tell he doesn't look right." The grand jury saw the footage. They deliberated for less than 3 hours. The indictment was unsealed 6 weeks later. Officer Daniel Mercer was charged with 8 federal counts, including interference with military personnel, false imprisonment of a federal employee, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law with bias enhancements. The combined charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence exceeding 50 years in federal prison. The press coverage was immediate. Officer arrests Navy operator over stolen valor claim. Federal charges filed in racial profiling case involving active duty sailor. The Brookhaven Police Department issued a public apology. It changed nothing. Mercer rejected a plea deal that would have reduced his sentence to 22 years. He insisted on going to trial. "I was doing my job," he told his attorney. "A jury will understand." The trial began 8 months later in federal court. Prosecutors called military experts who explained the uniform, the insignia, the ribbons, and the near impossibility of forging such credentials convincingly. They explained selection pipelines, attrition rates, the meaning behind the symbols. Mercer claimed not to believe. Chief Reed testified in uniform. He spoke calmly about his service, his deployments, and the moment he realized compliance would not save him. "When I showed my ID," Reed said, "and he still didn't believe me, I knew this wasn't about verification, it was about assumption." The jury watched the footage again. They watched Mercer escalate. They watched Reed comply. They watched bias become action. The defense argued suspicion. The prosecution showed pattern. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Mercer sat motionless as the foreperson read the decision. He did not look at Reed. Sentencing was scheduled for 90 days later, and this time there would be no misunderstanding about consequences. Sentencing day arrived with no drama, no spectacle, only finality. Officer Daniel Mercer stood before the federal judge in a courtroom packed with observers, reporters, and uniformed military personnel. Gone was the confidence he once carried on patrol. His shoulders sagged. His eyes stayed fixed on the table in front of him. The judge reviewed the case slowly. She cited the video evidence, the witness recordings, the pattern established through years of complaints, the refusal to acknowledge valid military credentials, the escalation of authority without lawful cause. "This court is not sentencing a mistake," she said. "It is sentencing a decision." Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed sat quietly behind the prosecution table, his wife beside him. Their daughters were not present. The judge had granted the family's request to shield them from the proceedings. The prosecutor stood. "This case is not about one arrest," she said. "It is about what happens when bias replaces judgment and power replaces law." Impact statements followed. Reed's wife described their children waiting at home with a handmade welcome sign that never got used. She spoke of the confusion on their faces when their father didn't come home, of explaining to 2 young girls why a police officer arrested a man who had just returned from protecting the country. Reed spoke last. "I did everything right," he said calmly. "I complied, I presented proof, I trusted the system." He paused. "The system failed until it corrected itself." The judge nodded once. She turned to Mercer. "You deprived a service member of his liberty. You interfered with military operations. You abused the authority entrusted to you." She took off her glasses. "For these reasons, this court imposes the mandatory minimum sentence." The room was silent. 54 years in federal prison. Mercer's attorney closed his eyes. Mercer's wife began to cry quietly. She would file for divorce before the month ended. At 38 years old, Mercer would not be eligible for release until he was well into his 90s. He was remanded into federal custody immediately. As marshals led him away, he looked up for the first time and saw Reed standing. Their eyes met briefly. Reed did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stood there in uniform. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Inside, the consequences continued. The Department of Justice announced a nationwide review of stolen valor arrests. New federal guidance required civilian law enforcement to accept military identification absent clear evidence of fraud. Additional penalties were established for racially motivated interference with service members. The Brookhaven Police Department entered a federal consent decree. 3 other officers resigned within months. Reed took 30 days of leave. He went home. 5 years later, the gas station footage became mandatory viewing at police academies and military briefings alike. A case study, a warning. Mercer began his 5th year inside a federal correctional facility, his life reduced to a cell and a number. Reed returned to active duty, promoted within 2 years, and completed his career with honor intact. One man lost decades because he chose assumption over law. The other continued serving because truth eventually outweighed bias. Years later, the case was still cited, not because it was rare, but because it was undeniable. The footage from the gas station played in classrooms, courtrooms, and training academies across the country. Recruits watched the moment where a routine interaction became a federal crime. They watched an officer approach with suspicion instead of neutrality. They watched proof be dismissed. They watched authority override law. And they were told the same thing every time. This is where it went wrong. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed never asked to become a symbol. He never sought attention. All he wanted that night was to finish a long drive, unlock his front door, and hug his children. Instead, he became a case study in how bias survives even under symbols of service. After retiring from active duty, Reed worked with veterans organizations and spoke privately to service members about their rights. He didn't speak with anger, he spoke with clarity. The uniform doesn't make you immune, he told them, but the law still matters. He reminded them to document, to stay calm. To understand that respect is not guaranteed, but accountability is real. Officer Daniel Mercer never gave another interview. Inside federal prison, he became just another inmate. No badge, no authority. No explanations that mattered. The system he believed he controlled ultimately judged him by the same standard he ignored: assumption, evidence, consequence. The Brookhaven Police Department changed policies, so did dozens of others. Military identification verification protocols were standardized nationwide. Racial bias training stopped being optional. None of it erased what happened, but it ensured it would be harder to repeat. The final report from the Department of Justice ended with a single line: authority without restraint is not law enforcement, it is abuse. Marcus Reed kept his uniform. Not because it proved who he was, but because it reminded him of what he survived. He had endured combat, he had endured separation, and he had endured disbelief. And still he went home, still he served, still he stood. Because in the end, the truth did not need permission to exist. It only needed to be recorded, and it was.